this evening, and I encourage you, if you don't already have your Bibles out, to be turning to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24, as we mentioned this morning, that will be where we spend our time this evening. We'll reference a few other passages here or there, but that will be the basis of our study this evening. If you've watched the news recently, if you've watched it at all, you'll have noticed that there are a lot of talks on the news about this war taking place over in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas over in the city of Gaza. And one of the reactions that I've seen by those on social media who are of religious backgrounds is, well, you see, this is the fulfillment of prophecy. There'll be wars and there'll be rumors of wars, and then they'll refer to what they call the rapture. Right? And we're not going to spend a great deal of time this evening dealing with the fact that it's not a rapture when Christ returns. That's just another study for another time. But then they say, well, that's what's going to happen after that rapture takes place. And they're referring, or others may say, well, that's when the end of time is going to take place, is when these things that are talked about take place. And so they look at verse 6, which Randy read for us a moment ago, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. And they say, well, that's a sign of the end of time. Ironically enough, a year ago, and it's over 500 days now, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I saw the same thing on Facebook back then. By people saying, see, it's a sign, here the end of time is imminent. Well, what we're going to focus on for a few moments this evening is asking the question, are these signs of the end of time? Is seeing these wars take place, or even hearing rumors of wars that could take place in nation invading nation, are these signs of the end of time? Is that what Jesus is talking about here in Matthew chapter 24? And so what we want to do is we want to look at three things this evening. The first of those is we'll look at what the events of Matthew 24 are. There are two, you could argue, three events that take place, two of those taking place simultaneously. We're then going to take some time to move through the text. And again, time will not permit us to go line by line through every detail, but we're going to kind of get a picture. We're going to get a picture of what's being talked about in Matthew 24. And then we're going to come back to those signs that are often pointed to and talk about those signs that we will have seen as we study through the text. And come back to those and put them back in the text, in the part where we found them, and what that text is talking about. So let's ask the question for a few moments this evening. Are these signs of the end of time? Well, again, let's begin with the events of Matthew chapter 24. As we talk about these signs, we need to understand there is more than one event under consideration in Matthew 24. And we'll see later on there's a clear distinction when we shift between events. But there are two events, again, you could argue three events that take place in Matthew 24. The reason I say two or three is two of those are the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple, but both took place simultaneously. When Jerusalem was destroyed, that was the time the temple was destroyed. But that's what sort of spurred on this conversation in the first place. We'll see that more in a moment. But Jesus here, just to give us a quick picture in verse 1, they're leaving the temple, and the disciples, it says, came and to point out to him the buildings of the temple. So as they're walking out, and you can imagine, here they see the temple, and they're pointing to, here's the temple, and how beautiful it was, and they're pointing out all of the structure and the buildings to Jesus, and Jesus points out to them in verse 2, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. That is, these stones you see here now, there's going to come a time where they're not staying there. They're going to be torn down. He's referencing AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem. And then the temple being destroyed. And so he says these stones are not going to be there one upon another. The disciples then ask him some questions. There are two questions that are asked. And we'll come back again to this later on when we get to the text and talk more about those two questions. But the first of those, or really both of those, were spurred as a result of Jesus pointing out that the temple would be destroyed. And then it leads to these two questions. And the first of those, he answers, the first one they ask has to do with these events, and he deals with the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem itself taking place in AD 70. That's the first event. Now again, we're going to look at an outline in a minute as to where the distinction between the two is. But we're just getting an idea right now that we're going to be dealing with two different events in Matthew chapter 24. Now the second event is heaven and earth passing away. Look at verse 35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now when we come here later on, we'll talk about the distinction in verse 36 then, but of that day, that transition, what day? That's when heaven and earth pass away. There's a distinction there. As he comes to verse 35 and is making the point that everything he's been saying in the first 34, verse 4 through 34 is going to come true, his words will not pass away, but heaven and earth will. Now of that day, that is when heaven and earth pass away, here's what he has to say beginning at verse 36. Both of those are under consideration. In fact, this is answering the second of the apostles' two questions, where they ask him, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Some translations say, end of the world. So, that's the second one. So the second event has to do with Christ's return and with the end of time, when this world will be destroyed. That's the two events that we have dealt with here in Matthew chapter 24. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and then heaven and earth passing away. Now let's come to the text itself. And we're going to come back to those two events. We now have a sort of overview of where you have two different events. But we're going to outline it now and put it back in the text so we can see these signs that are talked about in the immediate context of which those two are under consideration. Because that will greatly help us in our understanding of if we're seeing signs of the end of time taking place right now. But let's begin, before we get to the discussion beginning in verse 4, and talk about the announcement. We already mentioned this a moment ago, but there was an announcement where, here in verse 1, the disciples are starting by pointing to the temple's buildings. And again, you can imagine they're probably admiring greatly the construction of that temple and how beautiful it is. And Jesus points out to them that there's going to come a time, in verse 2, that that temple is going to be destroyed. It's not always going to be there. And so he points that out to them in verse 2, that eventually this temple is going to be destroyed. That's what leads to these two questions in verse 3. So he makes one announcement, this temple is going to be destroyed. That leads to two questions. It seems as though they think they're really asking one question. Maybe they realize they were asking two questions. But what they are asking has to do with two separate events. The first of those is the question about these things. So you get verse 3. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? So what things are they talking about? Well, these things, going back to verse 2, is when the temple would be destroyed and the stones would not be laid one upon another. And again, the temple being destroyed coincides with the destruction of Jerusalem. Those took place at the same time. So, when we're dealing here with, as we get later on, these things, that's the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. They then ask a second question, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? Now again, perhaps they were saying, and what will be the sign of this, or maybe they understood that this would be separate. Either way, what they asked had, in reality, was two questions. And the second one is about, when are you coming back? When are you coming? When will be the end of the age? And so they ask two different questions. So what Jesus does then is answer those two questions. And he answers them one at a time. Sometimes where some confusion exists is that either it's thought that he's answering one question, or that he's jumping back and forth between the two questions. And as we move through the text, it's clear he's moving one at a time. It's some confusing language, don't get me wrong, but it's not confusing as to what it takes under consideration. And we see that as we move through the text. So there was an announcement in verses 1 and 2. There were some questions in verse 3. Then in verse 4 through 51 is the answers. And it's important to note they are the answers. There were two answers, because there were two questions. When will these things, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, be? And what is the sign of your coming at the end of the age? That's the end of time. So there were two questions, so there's two different answers. Here's the first. He first deals with the first question and the destruction of Jerusalem, beginning at verse 4. He deals with the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, let's break it down into a few more sections here, subdivide it down a little further as we deal with the destruction of Jerusalem. And we have first what is before the tribulation in 4 through 14. So he deals with what's before the tribulation. The Lord answered them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And as you go throughout, he said, here are the things you're going to see taking place leading up to this event, the destruction of the temple. Then we're going to come and see the tribulation itself. And there's some things that are going to take place after the tribulation. That is this destruction. But Jesus points out, before the tribulation, here's what you're going to see. Verse 4 and 5, you're going to see false Christ coming. Verse 4 and 5, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. Now, we're going to come back to this here later on as well, but there are those who, before this would take place, are leading men astray by claiming to be the Christ. And so he's warning them here, see that no one leads you astray. Again, we'll come back to this same point later on as he deals with it from another standpoint. But there are those who are claiming to be the Christ. There then will be wars and rumors of wars. That's where that passage we often hear, and started with, takes place is in this first event in the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 6, and you will hear of wars and rumor of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And so he points out to them here, in this text, that there will be false Christ before the tribulation takes place. There will be wars and rumors of wars. Verse 7, B, there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. There's going to be some famines, there's going to be some natural disasters taking place with earthquakes. So there are going to be these things taking place. They're a sign before we get to the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 8 through 10, there will be a period of persecution before this takes place. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains or sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation. All right, so we're still leading up to the tribulation. They'll deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. So before this takes place, there's going to be a period of persecution. And during this period of persecution, there are some who are going to give up. There are some who are going to turn away and fall away and betray one another and hate one another, according to verse 10. That's going to take place prior to the events of the destruction of Jerusalem. Look at verse 11 now. There will be false prophets that go out, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. So we've got both false Christ and false prophets going out and leading people astray. We've got persecution, and some people are beginning to quit and give up on serving God because of persecution. Not only that, lawlessness will increase. And because lawlessness will be increased, we'll get to the latter half in a minute, but lawlessness is going to increase. And then there's going to be some spiritual apathy. The love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And so he says here, there'll be the love of many growing cold. There'll be some that are suffering from some spiritual apathy. They're going to kind of, they're not on fire for the Lord. They're going to start to go kind of cold, and they're more indifferent. They're not against Him, but they're not really strongly for Him. And there'll be some that are just sort of complacent where they're at. Obviously, there's always time there may be those complacent, but there's going to be more of that shortly before this takes place. And then verse 14, before this takes place, the gospel will go throughout the whole world and to all nations. Verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Not the end of time, the end of Jerusalem and the Jewish system. The fall of a nation, we'll come back to that here more in a moment, as we see another passage that will explain that. But before all that takes place, what's going to happen? Well, the gospel of the kingdom was going to be spread throughout the whole world and go to all nations. The Gentiles would hear the truth. Many others would hear the truth. And you go through the book of Acts, that takes place. When the book of Acts closes, we're somewhere around 62 or so AD when Acts closes, about 8 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. And by that point, which we're about 30 years after this, the gospel spread throughout the whole world. And there's a lot of this, some of this taking place, the events leading up to it already. But the gospel would go to all men before Jerusalem would be destroyed. Well, that's what takes place before the tribulation. Before we get to the event that is actually taking place, here are the signs it's getting close. But then there are some signs that it is imminent that we're given. And what they needed to do to when that took place. And so he talks then in 15 through 28 about the tribulation, the actual tribulation itself taking place. That begins, verse 15, with what is referred to as the abomination of desolation. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. And we'll pick up the rest of that sentence later on. But right now we just want to understand there will be this abomination of desolation taking place. And that's a quotation from the book of Daniel. And in chapter 9, when it says in verse 27, and he shall make a strong covenant with me for 1 week, and for half a week he shall put it into sacrifice and offering, and on the wings of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, till the decree ends poured out on the desolator. And so what he's saying is this abomination of desolation. You go back through history, that's the Romans standing in the temple. It would be the Romans that would enter into the temple before the destruction took place. That's a sign not only is it getting close, it's very imminent that it's fixing to take place. In fact, when you see that sign, verse 16 through 20, it's time to flee. Look at verse 16. Then, that is when you see this abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down and take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his clothes. And alas for the women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. What he says is, when you see this sign, it's imminent, and now you need to run. If you want to survive the destruction of Jerusalem, you need to get out. Because once that abomination of desolation takes place, it's very imminent. It's fixing to happen. And so when that takes place, there were some who, knowing what Jesus had foretold in Matthew 24, and in other cases, when they saw that abomination of desolation, the Romans standing in the temple, they got out and could be spared. So Jesus says, when you see that taking place, that's when the tribulation is very imminent. It's fixing to happen, and you need to run. Because then's going to come this great tribulation. Look at 21 and 22. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, it never will be. He says now, when that takes place, there's going to be a great tribulation take place. And tribulation is so great, there's been nothing seen like it before, and nothing that will be seen like it after. Nothing like it before, and nothing like it after. And then he says in verse 22, though, as great as that is, it will be shortened. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days would be cut short. It's going to be short. It's going to be quick what takes place with the destruction here. It's going to be a very intense period of tribulation, something unlike has ever been seen before, but it's going to be cut short. Otherwise, no human being would be saved, according to verse 22. So that's why you've got to flee. You've got to get out. Not only though, before the tribulation will false Christ arise, during the period of tribulation there will be false Christ arising. Look at verse 23 through 27. That if anyone says, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christ and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand, so if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, them, they're trying to lead people astray, even the elect. Now, there may be those in the world, those who never obeyed, they may follow them. There may be Jews who are looking for the Christ, who didn't listen and believe in Jesus, who may listen to these false Christ. But even some of the elect may be drawn away. You be ready ahead of time when that comes. You be prepared for that time. Someone will say, well, here it is, but verse 27, for as lightning comes from the east and shines as far as west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And this says, after this takes place and the false Christ arrives, you'll have the Romans who will be like the eagle or vulture on the carcass of Jerusalem. If you were driving home tonight and you saw vultures up in the sky, some translations say eagles, but if you saw vultures up in the sky, and they're circling around, you know what you understand? There's something over there that has died. Like they're circling something. And the point is that the Romans will be like the vultures circling the carcass of Jerusalem as it's brought to ruin. And so what's going to take place? Well, the abomination of desolation. Then you need to flee because there's going to be great tribulation. There'll be false Christs that are arising, and the Romans will be as the eagle or vulture circling the carcass of Jerusalem. Now what about after the tribulation? In 29-31, look what he says. After the tribulation, there'll be a change in order or downfall of a nation. In verse 29 it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now you read verse 29 and you say, what's he talking about? What does that mean? He's talking about the sun being darkened, the moon not giving light, the stars falling from heaven. What does that mean? This is where our familiarity with the Old Testament can help us. Because this kind of terminology has been used in the Old Testament. In Ezekiel 32, if you write your Bibles, we're not going to go there for time's sake this evening and go into any great detail. We'll mention about each of these. But in Ezekiel 32, 7 through 12, it talks about that language is used. In Isaiah 13 and verse 10, that language is used again, very similar language. Both of those are prophecies concerning the downfall of a nation. Isaiah 13, dealing specifically with Babylon, and uses some similar terminology. In Isaiah 13 and in verse 10, from the stars of heaven their consolation will not be light. The sun will be darkening at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. You look out there, and that's about the fall of Babylon. And the point is, this kind of terminology has been used before in prophecies that, by the way, the Jews should be familiar with from those writings and understand he's talking about the downfall of the nation. Well, when this takes place, when Jerusalem is destroyed, it's the fall of the Jews. Here, it's the fall of Jerusalem. That's coming down. Things are going to change. So after this tribulation takes place, there's going to be a change in order and downfall of the nation. Here's the sign of the coming in Judgment 30 and 31. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and all the tribes of earth will mourn, and they will see the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, with power and great glory, and he will send down his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from four winds from one end to the heaven of the other. Then you got the sign of coming in judgment. 30 and 31. Terminology again you can read being used of coming in judgment against them. That's what's taking place. As he's coming to them in judgment, not final judgment. We're looking for final judgment later on. But that kind of terminology is used of coming in judgment against the people. He's coming in judgment against them. So there's before the tribulation, and after the tribulation. But let's get to the question they really were wanting to know, that they asked, when does that happen? Look at verse 3 again. Here was their question. Tell us, when will these things be? Now, he didn't tell them, well, and X number of years on such and such a day, at such and such a time, this is when they're going to come. But he gave them the signs to point to it, and points out to them that when you see all these signs I've given to you, that's when this is going to take place. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and put out its leaves, you know the summer is near. He's illustrating the point. If you see the branches becoming tender on a fig tree, you know summer's getting near, it's getting ready to provide some fruit. Verse 33, so also, when you see all these things, what things? All the things I've just told you about, you know that he is near. at the very edge. When you see all these signs that I've been talking about, he says, that's when you know that judgment on Israel, when judgment on Jerusalem, that's when you know this punishment. That's when you know this destruction is going to take place. When you see all those signs. In fact, some of them would see it in their lifetime. Verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Some of these apostles standing there, and some were put to death before them, but some of them standing there saw this event take place. They were there, maybe not in Jerusalem, but around when Jerusalem fell. I believe the evidence is that John would write the book of Revelation about 20 years later, which means John was alive when Jerusalem fell. At least then. This generation will not pass away. He's telling you, not only is it coming, it's coming soon enough, this generation will see it. They'll see these signs, they'll see the fall of Jerusalem. But then verse 35 has a shift to deal with the end of time. That's what we're wanting to drive at in verse 35. There are those who, again, we take a step back and we look at this and say, well, is it the sign of his coming imminent? What he's been talking about in 4 through 34 was this event of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And in the coming and the downfall of the nation in verse 29. That's Jerusalem being destroyed. But then in verse 35, there's a little bit of a shift. In verse 36, we've got a full shift taking place. It begins to transition in verse 35 and talk about the end of time when he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So take the latter half first. My words will not pass away. He's saying, everything I told you about the destruction of Jerusalem, all these signs, that's going to happen. My word's not going to pass away. Now let's take the first half. Heaven and earth will pass away. Verse 36. But of that day, an hour, no one knows. That's our transition point. When we shift fully to talking about the end of time. Verse 35 mentions when heaven and earth pass away. Verse 36, but of that day, that is the day when heaven and earth pass away. No one knows. No one knows the day, no one knows the hour, except the Father only. Verse 36. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven or the Son, but the Father only. When heaven and earth passes away, he's saying, we don't know when that's going to be. There's going to be, verse 37 to 39, no warning, no signs. It's going to be like the days of Noah. Look at verse 37. For as in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. He said in verse 36, no one knows the day and hour. 37 through 39 is going to be like the days of Noah. You go back to the days of Noah and you read about that in Genesis. They didn't think the flood was coming. He's preaching and warning them, God's going to destroy the world with a flood, and they're sort of sitting back mocking him. That's not going to happen. Either there's some debate, it hadn't rained before, or, and I know this is true, one way or the other, it hadn't rained like that before. And by the way, it's not rained like that over the whole world ever again. And they were sitting back and mocking him, and then all of a sudden, they go to the earth, the door is shut, here comes the rain without warning. Well, they had some warning, but in the sense that they didn't know exactly when it was going to happen. And all of a sudden, it starts to happen, and now everybody's falling off. What's going on? Everybody's life is going about like normal. That day the flood came, you probably could have gone around a wedding somewhere. You could have found somebody sitting down at their table to eat. And then came the flood, and their life was destroyed. And the point is, that's how the coming of the Son of Man is going to be. That's how Christ's return is going to be. There will be people that are getting married, people at their table having dinner, people lying in bed sleeping. Everything's going to be like normal. There'll be some who may be driving to work at that moment. And then just like that, he's going to return. And we're going to give an account for how he lived. There's no warning, no sign. That asks verse 3, what will be the sign of your coming at the end of this age? And he says, on my return, there is no sign. It's going to come like a thief. It's going to come like the flood did in the days of Noah. All of a sudden, there it is. But not only is the day that's coming in which we do not know, it's a day in which the righteous and unrighteous are separated. Look at verse 45 beginning. Verse 45 beginning. And we should go through, not verse 45, verse 41 through 45. That should be 40 through 45. The two men will be in the field, one taken and one left. Two women will be running in the middle, one taken and one left. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day our Lord is coming. This passage here, excuse me, is a passage, I said we're not going to deal with this in great detail, but it's a passage sometimes referred to talk about a rapture. One's taken, one's left. We know this principle here can't contradict other biblical principles, and we know that when Christ returns, all are going to give an account that day. The point up here in Matthew chapter 24, and this passage, we're sitting there wants to it, is not that some are going to actually be left behind and others be taken, but there's going to be a separation that takes place between those that are righteous and those that are unrighteous. The very next chapter is going to point that out. Right? We have the wise that come inside the wedding feast and the fools left outside. We've got those that used their talents who were rewarded, and the ones that didn't, that were thrown out in outer darkness. We've got the sheep and we've got the goats. Some on the right, some on the left. There's a separation taking place between the righteous and the unrighteous. That's when the righteous, when he returns, the righteous will have their reward and the wicked will be punished. There's a separation going to take place. And because of that, we need to be ready. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day our Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known at what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whose master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is the servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if the wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. What Jesus says is, you don't know when I'm coming. And when I come, the righteous and the unrighteous will be separated, and so you be ready so you're found righteous. Be the one watching. Don't be the wicked servant who says, oh, my master's delaying. He's delaying, so I'll do what I want. Be the one who's found faithful. A faithful steward of those things, the one that when he comes, the master can reward. You don't know when he's coming. Just like that servant may sit back and say, well, he's kind of delaying. He's not come yet. But he was coming. He did. And at an hour, he did not expect. You see, what we need to realize is, when the end of time comes, we don't know when it's going to take place. It could be today, tomorrow, 10,000 years from now. We don't know. But on that day, the righteous and the unrighteous will be separated. So therefore, we must always be ready when he comes. That's the text of Matthew chapter 3. We ask the question, though, are these signs of the end of time? Well, we took a study of Matthew 24. We looked at the events of it, we looked at the text. Let's go back and talk just a little bit more about these signs that are often alluded to. The signs, first and foremost, are not about Christ's return. Well, as we just looked at, the day of Christ's return will be as the days of Noah, where life is going on normal. Go read through Matthew 24 again. That's not normal life. That's not how things are going on normally, the way it's described. That's why the signs would stand out to people. There's things that didn't work quite normal. In the days of Noah, life was normal. It'll be like the thief in the night. We talked about this in our invitation on Wednesday evening. If you knew a thief was breaking into your house tonight, you'd be ready for it. You'd be sitting up waiting. You'd be waiting and call the cops when you hear them coming in. have to do with the end of time. No, there are no signs of the end of time. Instead, they are pointing to the destruction of Jerusalem. Again, 32 through 34. Look at 32 through 34 again with me. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts out its leaf, you know the summer is near. So, when you see all these things, you know that He is near at the very gates. He's near. Judgment's near. This thing that He's been talking about, the destruction of Jerusalem, is near. When you see all these signs going back, whatever the event of verse 33 is, that generation would see. What would they see? They would see the event where the abomination of desolation took place. The famines, the war, the rumors of war, the false Christ, all these things. They would see that. I started checking there's no 2,000-year-old men won't be around. Not only would those events take place in the disciples' lifetime, and the signs would point to them, there's a very clear shift between the two events. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day. Again, what day? When heaven and earth pass away. You write your Bible, circle the word, circle that phrase, but concerning that day. Go back to verse 35 and circle, heaven and earth will pass away. Draw a line between them. That's that day when heaven and earth pass away. No one knows. There's a shift between events. And it's that first event, again, is when the temple would be destroyed alongside Jerusalem that all those signs are pointing to. In verse 2. You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be one stone left upon another that will not have been thrown down. The temple's going to be destroyed. Question 1 then. When will these things be? When that temple is destroyed. We saw it in the text. We go throughout. When we get to 32 through 34, he says, well, that will happen when all these signs take place. He's still talking about that first event. And then the shift happens in verse 35 and 36. The sign is about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. This is not the same as heaven and earth passing away. The temple being destroyed is not the same as heaven and earth passing away. Or it's not the same as heaven and earth passing away. Nor is Jerusalem being destroyed. Those are different. But the signs would point to the temple being destroyed, and as we said in verse 29, the signs would point to the downfall of a nation. The downfall of a people. And that day when Jerusalem fell, that's exactly what took place. That's what the signs are talking about. So let's come back to the question we began with. Are these signs of the end of time? Well, no, not from what we've seen in the text. Because the text says, those are signs of the destruction of Jerusalem, but remember this too. No, the end will come without warning. It could be today, tomorrow, again, 10,000 years from now. It's going to come, it's a certainty. Peter would point that out in 2 Peter 3. But there's no signs we can look to that says, you know what, it's coming right now. Here's a question for you as we come to a close this evening. Since the end of time, since Christ's return, Christ's return is going to come without warning. He said we need to be ready. We need to always be ready and watching. Are you ready? Are you watching? Are you waiting for that day to come? So that if he was to return tonight, you'd be found faithful to Him, in a right relationship with Him, where you can have that home in heaven, that you can be with Him for all eternity. If you're here and you obey the gospel, keep on being faithful serving Him if you're serving Him faithfully. But if you're here and you're not obeying the gospel, then you're not ready right now. But you can get ready. If you've heard the Word of God and you believe that Jesus is Christ, the Son of God, we are repenting your sins, confess your faith in Him, and be buried in the waters of baptism. Rise and walk in the newness of life, knowing that if tonight is the night He returns, you can be with Him in heaven for all eternity. If you're here tonight and somewhere along the line aren't been as faithful as they need to be. If it's a sin of a private nature, you can take to God privately in prayer. If it's a sin of a public nature, you desire the prayers of the congregation. We will gladly pray with you for you for God and for you. No matter what you need, this is to anyway, it's not for right now, so you understand. And as we sing.